The city of Dundee, a magnificent sight on the north bank of Britain's greatest river. As majestic as Naples with her spacious bay, or Quebec on the mighty St. Lawrence. 118 miles long, the Tay drains 2,500 square miles of land and no less than 70 freshwater lochs. Bigger than the combined river systems of both the Thames and the Severn, it's not surprising then that this mighty river has played a major part in the story of Dundee. Over the centuries, the Tay has provided Dundee with a means of defence, trade, communication and prosperity, and the river can be seen on almost every page of Dundee's epic story. From the south bank, across 1.5 miles of water, is the best place from which to see the extinct volcano of the Law, and also the many other hills upon which today's modern city is built. The Balgay Hill, Mingy's Hill, Hawk Hill, the Bonnet Hill, Balgillo Hill, and Barn Hill. But other hills upon which Dundee was built, such as Castle Hill, Windmill Hill, and Corby Hill, have all disappeared during the years of the city's development. But the very earliest settlements in this area were not on any of these hills, but here at the raised beaches of Stannergate, midway between today's city centre and Broughty Ferry. Nomadic tribesmen from Eastern Europe settled here perhaps 10,000 years ago because of the abundance of fish and mussels. Their name for the river was Ta, meaning to melt or flow. And almost 2,000 years ago, the Roman historian Tacitus named the river Taws. The name Dundee comes from the early Celtic languages as Dundeig, meaning either Daig's fort or hill of fire. But the next settlements in Dundee's story were more permanent, at a site 2 miles to the west of Stannergate, at the Castle Rock. And here at St. Paul's Cathedral in the busy High Street, we can still see traces of the massive rock on which Daig's fort was built. And inside the cathedral, behind this door in the library, can be seen more of the original part of the ancient rock face. In those days, the river came up to the top of Commercial Street, and even now, when tides are especially high, shops in the street can be regularly flooded in their basements. But the river and the marshlands to the north of Commercial Street, at Meadowside, proved for many years to be a useful defence against invaders. And despite the repeated attempts of the Roman legions of the day, they never succeeded in conquering any lands to the north of the Tay. The oldest parts of Dundee as we know it today are the Sea Gate, where the mouths of the Skooring Burn and the Dens joined the Tay, and the Cowgate, near to what was the main source of drinking water, the Lady Well, now recalled in the name of this more modern watering hole. The Lady Well was at the foot of a separate cluster of dwellings, which became the hill town. So it was that in these few streets around the old castle, that Dundee's story continued throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, while Scotland became united. But because of its strategic importance, Dundee soon became occupied by the English, a situation not to everyone's liking. And it was here, at a spot marked by this plaque in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, that a young pupil from the local seminary named William Wallace struck the first blow for his country's freedom. Involved in an argument with the son of the English Governor Selby, Wallace stabbed him and had to flee, thus beginning his legendary campaign for Scottish freedom. And Dundee's Braveheart connections continued when, in Dundee Castle, Robert the Bruce was declared King of Scots in 1309, and came after Bannockburn to live in Dundee, granting a royal charter to the town in 1327.
This charter is a confirmation charter of Robert the Bruce in 1327. He describes himself as Robert, King of Scots. And Dundee had been really hammered in the Wars of Independence and had lost all its early charters and early documents. So Dundee would have had many documents before this. We know, for example, that it was granted a special trading agreement by King John, as in Magna Carta, in 1199. So we know that that would have been in the charter chest. But because the charter chests had been taken away, burnt, the castle had been razed to the ground, Robert I issued this confirmation. Confirmation of the rights of Dundee as enjoyed by the burgesses of Berwick. We must remember at this time Berwick was one of the first Scottish boroughs, so all Dundee's rights compared to Berwick. And you have the chicken and egg situation of the town and the fair. Do you have the fairs before the town is granted, or did you then have towns built where fairs had been before? So a lot of this document tells how you're allowed to have a fair, how you're going to run it, and it's tied up with the idea of a burgess, of a free person. You cannot trade unless you have the equivalent of a street trader's license. And this is one of a set of three, in that Robert I asked the Abbot of Arbroath to make an inquiry about Dundee's rights. The Abbot of Arbroath replied to King Robert, and then this is the third in line, this is the actual royal charter, that at one time would have had a seal tag here and a nice royal seal with King Robert sitting in judgment in wax. But because this is such an important document and produced before Parliament so many times as a proof of Dundee's rights, that has been worn away in time.
But what do modern Dundonians think or know about the history of their city?
When I think about Dundee, one of the first things that comes to mind is the whaling and the shipping, the old shipping that we have down at the quay.
I think about the jute jam and journalism, and when the Mansfield discovery and most of the people died, things like that.
Well, I think of, first of all, jute jam and journalism. And then, of course, there was the Taybridge disaster, which I have read about, but I wasn't here then.
Jam, jute and journalism.
But there's far more to Dundee's story than jam, jute and journalism. However, just as many of its former magnificent buildings have been demolished in the name of progress, the city's story too has been neglected, or perhaps just taken for granted. Much has certainly been lost. For 500 years, from the 11th to the 16th century, there stood in this part of Dundee a magnificent palace, built by King Malcolm III for his English Queen Margaret. Sadly, there is now no trace of the palace or Whitehall Close in which it stood. But just a short distance away, this mighty church, built around the same time and dedicated to the Virgin Mary, became accepted as being the most magnificent in Scotland. The old steeple survives, clear evidence of the wealth and continuing importance of the town by the end of the 15th century. This Dundonian, Hector Boyce, was one of Scotland's earliest historians, and his Chronicles of Scotland, written in Latin in 1526, has been highly influential in our view of the Middle Ages. Boyce describes Dundee as an industrious and prosperous town, with many employed in the making of cloth. This plaque commemorates the three Wedderburn brothers, sons of a merchant who lived at West Kirkstyle in the old Overgate. Two of the brothers, John and Robert, went into the priesthood, and the third, James, became a merchant like his father. Robert and James together wrote satirical plays which were prosecuted by the church authorities. In a room in the old steeple, Robert, who at that time was Vicar of Dundee, wrote a famous allegory titled The Complaint of Scotland, and collaborated with John in a collection of ballads, the Book of Good and Godly Psalms, now known simply as the Dundee Psalms. And these highly influential writings of the Wedderburns were to vigorously fan the flames of the forthcoming religious revolution. One of the new Protestant preachers to emerge when the Reformation began was George Wishart, and Dundee became known throughout Europe as the Second Geneva because of its enthusiasm for religious reform, and this arch in the Cowgate is named after Wishart. Built long after his death, it marks the spot where he would regularly preach, even when the plague was at its height and ravaging his audience. It was here also that he was to foil an assassination attempt on his life, masterminded by the Catholic Cardinal Beaton. His memory is also continued in this building in King Street, formerly the Wishart Memorial Church, and more recently known as the Wishart Centre. In the civil wars which followed the Reformation, Dundee was invaded by the French Catholic armies of the infant Mary Queen of Scots, and also by the English Protestant forces of Henry VIII, who constructed a fortress on Balgalow Hill. That fortress, long since destroyed, and Broughty Castle, seen here, which at that time was only reachable at low tide by a causeway, were besieged for 3 long years. This painting shows the recapturing of Broughty Castle by French and Scots soldiers loyal to Mary, with Balgalow Castle burning fiercely in the background. Pitkerro House on the outskirts of Broughty Ferry was where Mary stayed during her visit to Dundee in 1565. The young queen, only 23 years old, was warmly received by the people of Dundee, despite the Reformation troubles. She spent 2 nights in this splendid house and planted this chestnut tree in the spacious grounds. Pitkerro House is still lived in today, now divided into flats. During her visit, Mary also granted monastery land to the town of Dundee for use as burial ground, which became known as the Howth. A typical Dundee merchant's house of the 16th century was Gardine's Land, which shows the opulence of Dundee as one of the leading Scottish ports of the time. Dundee's merchants exported coarse woolens, sheepskins, whale oil and linen, and they imported salt, dyes, wines and tobacco. Parts of Gardine's house remain today, although it is easier to see what it was like from this excellent model. By this time, the hereditary constables of Dundee had built themselves a formidable castle in the high ground at Dudhope, overlooking the town. There were often disputes between the constables and the council, just as there were disputes between the council and Dundee's 9 incorporated trades, whose devices are represented on this stone. As we've heard, the Wedderburns were a merchant family in the town, and were in the forefront of trade with the Baltic nations. For more than 150 years of Dundee's story, this family was to hold the office of town clerk, and had to deal with these disputes over rights and privileges. In the 16th century, Dundee's Market Cross was situated in the Seagate, In the tall booth, which stood next to the cross, meetings of the Scottish Parliament, the Convention of the Estates, and the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland were all held here. At this time, Dundee was Scotland's second most important town. But in 1651, the old steeple of St. Mary's was to bear witness to the rude shattering of almost a century of prosperous peace. It was in this room, high in the steeple, that Dundees Governor of the time, Robert Lumsden, made his heroic last stand, holding out for 3 days against Cromwell's men commanded by General Monk. Dundee at this time was a well-fortified town, and had been holding out successfully against a bombardment by Monk's army in a siege which lasted 6 weeks. But Monk discovered that a local lad was being allowed into the town to play with his friends, and the boy told him that the garrison soldiers breakfasted in the alehouses, and by lunchtime were so drunk they could barely stand. Monk therefore ordered an afternoon attack, and the town's defences were overrun. More than 1,200 soldiers and citizens were slaughtered in the attack, including at least 200 women and children. Governor Lumsden retreated to St. Mary's and held out until Monk's men piled straw around the base of the tower and set fire to it, smoking its defenders out. Lumsden and his men were forced to surrender, but were shown no mercy. Lumsden's head was impaled on a spike, where it remained for 9 years as a gruesome deterrent to others. The English soldiers next turned upon the townsfolk, with the mayhem lasting for days, the dead being buried in mass graves near the steeple. Monk's men loaded Dundee's treasures onto about 60 boats and ships of all sizes, but due to a freak storm, the whole lot sank without trace in the Tay estuary. After this tragic episode in Dundee's story, the city was never quite able to regain its national importance. The town became divided between those like John Graham of Claverhouse, who backed the Stuart monarchs, and those Dundee merchants and bailies who were supporters of the Presbyterian cause. Claverhouse, or Bonnie Dundee as he was known, owned this castle at Claypots. He became constable in 1684 and took increasing interest in affairs in the disloyal borough of Dundee. 4 years later, he was appointed provost of the town by the king, and when revolution broke out, he rode out from here at Mayens Castle to plant the Stuart standard on the law in defiance of William of Orange.
To the Lords of Convention 'twas Claverhouse spoke, here the King's crown go down, there are crowns to be broke. So each cavalier who loves honour and me, let him follow the bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle my horses and call out my men, unhook the Westport and let us get free. For it's up with the bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee. Dundee he is mounted, he rides up the street, the bells they ring backward, the drums they are beat. But the provost, this man, says Justine, let it be, for the tune is well rid o' that devil Dundee. Come fill up my cup, come fill up my can, come saddle my horses and call out my men, unhook the Westport and let us get free. For it's up with the bonnets, oh Bonnie Dundee.
Before Claverhouse charged defiantly into glory on the braes of Killiecrankie, he revisited Dundee to recruit soldiers for the Jacobite cause, but was rebuffed. However, in the second Jacobite rising in 1715, the borough was in the hands of royalists under a new Graham, Graham of Duntroon, and the old pretender was welcomed back by cheering crowds. He stayed in a house in the Seagate, awaiting the arrival of a Spanish ship carrying gold, but it foundered in the estuary, where it remains to this day. Then James fled, and with him most of the Jacobite magistrates. In 1745, Some local men enlisted under these colours to fight for Prince Charlie in the Laird of Kinloch's Jacobite brigade. However, just a few days after the Battle of Culloden, Dundee was bankrupted by the purchase of a gold box to be presented with the freedom of the borough to the Duke of Cumberland, and the town was to remain a strong centre of support for the Hanoverians. Throughout the late 18th and much of the 19th centuries, Dundee became known as the Radical Town, a hotbed of support for political and social change. It's reported that in 1793, one of the booksellers had sold over 1,000 copies of The Rights of Man by Tom Paine. In 1801, the Reformers founded a newspaper called the Dundee Advertiser. At this time, many weavers and craftsmen joined the workingmen's discussion groups and radical political societies such as the Friends of Liberty. But one group of radicals was more extreme. The United Scotsmen was a secret group, based mainly in the Dundee area, who, amongst other things, campaigned vigorously for a Scottish Parliament and universal suffrage. Trees of liberty were planted to signify support for the revolutionaries in France and the American colonies. And this plaque in the Perth Road recalls these events and also the legendary occasion when Dundee's infamous Provost Riddick was dragged from his bed in his nightshirt and forced to dance around a liberty tree. One of the most notable of those who continued the struggle a few years later was Dundee's George Kinloch. Kinloch was born into a wealthy family, not far from where his statue stands today in Albert Square. He was a vigorous campaigner for civic improvements, clashing with Provost Riddick over much-needed changes for the harbour. Riddick and his allies had been personally profiting while restricting developments in the town, and they succeeded in keeping their hands on the Provost's chain for almost 40 years. Riddick's money-making methods involved buying property which the council needed and then selling it back at a vast profit. It is then perhaps appropriate that Riddick's large leather wallet has survived all these years. In 1796, he bought 90 feet of property in Crichton Street and sold back just 5 feet of it to the council some months later for a third of what he had originally paid for the whole lot. From his business gains, he was able to build himself this grand house at Nethergate, now owned by the Clydesdale Bank. The issue of political reform was also raised by George Kinloch at a public meeting here at Magdalen Yard, attended by 10,000 Dundonians. Greatly encouraged by the size of his audience, Kinloch accused the Home Secretary of treason against the people and called for one man, one vote. But this greatly alarmed the authorities, who feared an armed rebellion, and Kinloch was forced to flee. The fears of the authorities were intensified because at the time there were only 6 officers of the town guard to keep order throughout the whole town. But the new textile industries had caused the population to increase rapidly to 30,000, many of whom lived in desperate poverty. And yet it is recorded that the town was generally peaceful. The naming of this street, built in 1832, celebrated the passing of the Reform Act, which gave the vote to the middle classes. In the celebrations, a grand parade passed through the new Reform Street, and George Kinloch was pardoned and was permitted to return to Dundee to be elected as its first Reformed Member of Parliament. Sadly, only 1 year before he was to die in 1833. While neighbouring Broughty Ferry had always been known as a fishing village, Dundee had been known mainly as a port and as a whaling centre. The history of Dundee whaling dates from as far back as the 12th century, and the city was widely known as the home port for generations of hardy whaling men.
There's a noble fleet of whalers a-sailing fae Dundee, well manned by British sailors, they work upon the sea. On the western ocean passage, none with them can compare, for the smartest ship to mark the trips to Ballina, I declare. For the wind is on the quarter, and the engine's working free, there's no another whaler a-sailing fae Dundee can beat the old Ballina, so you needna try her on, for we'll challenge all both big and small fae Dundee tae St. John.
Dundee beat off challenges from Peterhead and other ports to become the undisputed whaling capital of the world. There were great scenes on public holidays when most of the population would assemble to give a rousing send-off to whalers such as the Ballina, the Advice, the Polar Star, the Narwhal, and the Camperdown, whom they might not see again for anything up to 2 years. Such were the send-offs that the whalers often had to anchor in mid-river to recover from the festivities before sailing on the next tide. But massive overfishing led to decline in the industry, and the days of whaling were soon to be over. Many Dundonians had gone to icy graves in the Arctic Ocean, including many of the crew of the Chieftain in 1884. Only 2 small boats, unable to find their parent ship in a sudden fog, were eventually found 200 miles away off Iceland, and thus some of the crew were miraculously saved. Later, the Terra Nova, the last whaling ship to be built in Dundee, was to carry Captain Scott to the South Pole. And yet another famous Dundee ship, the Discovery, saw much service in the pack ice of the Arctic and the Antarctic. But the port really began to boom in the 19th century as a centre for imports and exports, and as a world leader in shipbuilding. Locally produced linen, thread, sailcloth and cotton bagging were exported around the world, and Dundee and Arbroath provided almost all of the canvas needed by both the Royal and the Merchant Navies. As we've heard from the writings of Hector Boyce, Dundee had long been known for making cloth, and by 1778 there were 2,000 linen handlooms clattering busily throughout the town. Men and women flocked into Dundee from the surrounding countryside to work in the expanding linen industry. Steam-driven mills were pioneered in the city by James Ivory and Company, and also by the Carmichael brothers. James Carmichael, commemorated by this statue in Albert Square, invented the idea of reverse gear and fan blast cooling. He also built the first locomotives for the Dundee-Newtile Railway. There had been foundries in the Dock Street area since 1290, and in the early 19th century there were the Carmichaels, the Douglases, and the Lilybank foundries. In the 1830s and 40s, Dundee's engineering skills and the name Carmichael became world famous. Dundee was now in its greatest industrial period. This is a model of the London, a steel schooner of unprecedented luxury, built by the men of Gourlay's, one of Dundee's 3 famous shipbuilding companies. It had a music room luxuriously embellished with carved scenes from Sir Walter Scott. It had rosewood pilasters and gilded cornices, electric light and 300 horsepower steam engines. Gourlay's, founded in 1790, was to become the greatest shipbuilding company in Britain. In the heyday of shipbuilding, and for more than a century, generations of Dundee workers had been masters of their craft, building some of the finest ships in the world. And of course, jute will be ever associated with Dundee, with the rise of this industry being as spectacular as its fall was disastrous. The demise of the woolen industry led to the advent of linen and other textiles, but early experiments with raw jute were not successful. It was not until the accidental adding of whale oil to a batch of raw jute in Dundee warehouse, a man called Watt, that the prospect of a better and more commercially acceptable product was seen. By 1838, Dundee had no less than 72 mills and factories. The state owed to the way of the bars, calling the weavers and spinners to work. The Crimean War gave a huge demand for sacking and tent material made of Dundee jute instead of Russian flax. In America, there was an insatiable need for covers for the wagons which pushed the American frontier ever westward. Later, both sides in the American Civil War needed jute material, ammunition sacks, and sandbags. Soon there were almost 200 factory chimneys on the Dundee skyline. Many of these mill buildings still exist today. This is Baxter Brothers' Upper Den Works, which has recently been converted to housing. And across the road is the Lower Dens Works. There was Gilroy's Tea Works, the massive Manhattan and Caldrum Works, but the biggest mill by far, in 1866 the largest factory in Europe, was the Camperdown Mill in Lochee. Owned by the Cox family, it employed 14,000 people, mainly women and boys, and even had its own railway station. This Italian-style campanile chimney, known as Cox's Stack, remains a landmark today. While other parts of the huge factory have been converted to housing. By 1911, Dundee's population had soared to 165,000, but labour had become cheaper, younger, and even more prepared to accept worsening conditions. In fact, the Dundee School Board allowed children exemption from school to work as shifters or part-time workers for up to 14 hours a day.
Oh dear me, the mills gaen fast, the pair wee shifters canna get their rest. Shift and bobbins, coarse and fine, the fairly mak your work for your 10 and 9. Oh dear me, I wish the day was done, running up and down the pass is no nae fun. Shifting, piece and spinning, warp, weft and twine, to feed and cled my bairnie, often 10 and 9. Oh dear me, the world's all divided, them that work the hardest are that I wi' the least provided. But I mind bide contented, dark days are fine. There's nae much pleasure living of a 10 and 9.
The jute workers were housed in some of the worst conditions in Europe, in grim, hastily built tenements around the mills in East Clippington, Dens Road, Jura Street, and in Lochee. The problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation were worsened by large-scale immigration from Ireland, particularly into Lochee. Most of the wells became polluted by sewage, but people still took water from these wells, from vendors known as water caddies or aquadors. By 1835 there were 20 such aquadors who sold up to 1,000 gallons every day at a penny per 10 gallons, and were fierce rivals for trade. Almost a third of all Dundee babies at the time died in infancy, while the lifespan of a Dundee worker was only 33 years, compared to 62 in rural Angus. Right up to the 1890s, children were being forced to earn a premium in Dundee's jute mills known as blood money, which led to massive profits for the jute millionaires, allowing them to build grand houses such as these in West Ferry. At this time, Dundee, along with Bowden and Manchester, were the wealthiest residential areas in Britain. But these were turbulent years, with frequent strikes and lockouts. The large number of women now employed in the jute industry were not allowed to join trade unions, which at that time were for men only. But when this was changed and they were allowed to join, they quickly became the most active. It was the female spinners, given the vote for the first time in 1922, who were responsible for the election of Neddy Scrymgeour, the only prohibitionist ever elected to Parliament. Winston Churchill had expected an easy victory in that general election in Dundee, but was defeated by Scrymgeour, who remained a Dundee MP until 1931. At this point in Dundee's story, women were playing a leading role in the city's development.
Dundee was known as a women's town, and the reason for that was that of all of the Scottish cities, the major Scottish cities, Dundee had a higher proportion of women workers. They dominated the textile industry. They worked as weavers, as spinners, as preparers, and outside of the mills, many of them, especially old women, were employed as sack sewers in rather miserable conditions until mechanisation at the turn of this century. Dundee was unusual in the sense that a higher proportion of married women worked than in most other and all other Scottish towns. They were often the head of household in that sense, and the consequence of that was that males often had a subordinate role within the household, thus known as kettle boilers. The mill and factory workers in Dundee were strong supporters of the suffragette movement. They were more involved in strike activity. Numerous strikes in the textile industry in the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. Dundee workers, women workers, were defiant. They were certainly not deferential, and they often dropped tools or marched out of the mill in demand of a wage increase or in order to resolve some grievance.
In 1901, 8 out of 10 women and 1/3 of all men in Dundee were employed in the jute industry. There seemed no end to expansion, but world competition, not least from Calcutta, where labour was even cheaper, sealed Dundee's fate. There was widespread, prolonged and severe hardship when the jute industry began to collapse at the end of the First World War. The second of Dundee's famous 3 J's, jam, has also gone. Keeler's orange marmalade was world famous in the late 19th century, but is now made in England. However, the third J, journalism, remains. D.C. Thomson, and independent Scottish-owned newspaper company, employs almost 2,000 people in the city, with hundreds more in its regional offices in London, Glasgow and Manchester. And there are other, perhaps lesser-known pages in Dundee's story, such as Queen Victoria passing through the town in 1844, the royal entourage disembarking in Shore Terrace and proceeding through an arch subsequently named the Royal Arch. Although the arch was later removed, her brief visit is commemorated by this statue. And the skeleton of a humpback whale displayed here in the Barrack Street Museum has for over 100 years proved one of Dundee's most famous attractions. The whale first appeared in the estuary in December 1883, and for several weeks resisted all attempts to capture it, but was eventually washed up on the beach at Inverbervie and auctioned at Dundee. Modern attitudes regarding whaling are more enlightened, but the magnificence of the Tay whale still captures the imagination. Dundee's story has featured many great characters, including the Reverend Thomas Dick, a leading astronomer and author in the early 19th century. James Chalmers, buried in the Howff, invented postage stamps a year before Sir Rowland Hill took the credit. Viscount Adam Duncan, born in the Seagate, defeated the French at the Battle of Camperdown and is commemorated in the large house and park named after the battle. In the same year, a girl called Fanny Wright was born in Milnes Buildings. Nearby at 136 Nethergate, there is a plaque to her memory. Fanny became a leading feminist author and anti-slavery campaigner in America, where she is revered to this day. There is a plaque also to another famous Dundonian, William Lyon Mackenzie, who became one of Canada's founding fathers. And this famous painting in the McManus Galleries, titled Riders of the Sea, is by Dundee's George Dutch Davidson, recognised as the finest painter of the Art Nouveau period. But James Bowman Lindsay is without doubt one of the greatest of Dundonians. A self-educated child weaver, he became a teacher at Dundee Prison. He was offered a post at the British Museum, but declined the offer, not wishing to leave his aged mother, with whom he lived at 11 South Union Street in somewhat poor circumstances. Lindsay was the first person to use electricity to light a room. The first place in the world where electric light was demonstrated was at the Thistle Hall in Dundee in 1836. The hall no longer exists, but its elaborate facade can still be seen in Union Street. Incredibly, James Bowman Lindsay also invented telegraphy, astronomical dating, and a dictionary in 80 languages. But one of the saddest chapters in Dundee's story must be the railway bridge disaster of December 1879. The central girders of the bridge failed to withstand strong crosswinds during a terrific storm and collapsed as a train was crossing in the dark. All 75 passengers and railwaymen on board died. Due to inferior construction by the North British Rail Company, the bridge buttresses were much weaker than they should have been, and in some places had been completed with a mixture of beeswax and iron filings. The stumps of the central girders of the old bridge can still be seen in the river, with a stronger and better replacement bridge being constructed alongside them in 1887. Dundee's other bridge, the Tay Road Bridge, recently celebrated its 30th anniversary. For those who record the past, it is perhaps unfortunate that Dundee has been built and rebuilt over the same ground, with few old buildings surviving. But today's Dundee is a modern cosmopolitan place with international links spanning the globe. The city has 2 universities and is recognised as a world leader in biomedical research, including carrying out pioneering work into cancer research and keyhole surgery. And Dundee continues to play a major role in light engineering, successfully combining new technologies with some of the city's older, more established skills to produce world-class products such as automatic banking machines, micro-televisions and computers. And Dundee is also a major force in the food retail sector. But above all, the story of Dundee has been the story of the people who have lived and worked in the city. Of the people who defended their town against invaders from Rome, France, the Highlands and from England. Of the people who sailed the icy oceans of the world in whaling ships and merchant clippers. Of the people who toiled long and hard in Dundee's jute mills, shipyards and factories. And of the people who throughout the ages have strived to make Dundee a better place for her citizens to live. And it will be the people of this great city who will continue to write the next chapter